Is your colleague quiet? Is your colleague quiet?
He doesn't read.
He's a colleague. So, how is your today?
So we're going to start up the Wondermoment over here, project-based learning by Trevor Muir.
This one is Samen.
That's Samen.
It's not my glass. What time does this go to? Okay, a little bit. All right, I'm going to get started. So my name is Trevor, and I just got done. I just want to point out that I did not have Starbucks this morning. I got Dutch coffee. Some people from my side of the world got Starbucks for breakfast, and I don't want you to hold it against them.
It was just a cup.
It was just the cup. Oh, okay. Yeah, okay.
Very good. No, yeah.
He's proud of it.
I wrote an eagle.
Yeah, he wrote an eagle here today. So anyway, we only have about 36 minutes before we move on to the next thing. So I just want to give you an overview of project-based learning, and I want to go into much more detail about some of the processes I use in my own classroom. But I want to give you just kind of an overview and have a little bit of a discussion about it. I wrote a book called The Epic Classroom that's all about making the classroom experience for students memorable. So all about making sure that what they're doing doesn't just dissipate when they're done in our rooms, but actually stays with them. And that's what I'm going to go into detail later with my keynote. But the real process that we follow, that I follow, is project-based learning. I'd love to hear, is project-based learning, is that something that we have over here? Is that a term that you're familiar with?
Yes.
PBL is another way we put it. So let's start with this. What do you think, talk to the person next to you, what is the difference between authentic and applicable in terms of what happens in our classrooms? So what's the difference between authentic and applicable? Have a discussion with people around you about that. Sure. Well, applicable comes from the word apply. Is that what it means? So, and that's why I'm asking. We're defining it now. Someone be willing? Would someone be willing to share their definition of the word applicable? Like what does applicable mean in terms of what we do? Yes?
Well, if you can actually apply it, so if it's according to the student's level, if it's according to the student's needs and interests, so if they can actually apply it, so if they already have the level, or if you as an instructor think they have the level, they're able to fulfill the assignment.
And apply it to what?
Can be anything. It could be applied to their interests, could be applied to their current skill, their education level.
Okay.
It could be multiple things.
Excellent. Does anybody want to add on to that definition? So able to apply it to their interest, to their education level?
To a real-time problem.
Yes. To a real problem?
Real problem, yeah.
Yeah, so applicable, yeah, exactly. So the work that they're doing could apply at some point to something else, right? So if we're doing algebra now, someday that could apply to work I do in engineering. Or, what? Does that make sense? What about authentic? What does authentic mean?
Well, also real.
Mm-hmm.
So I was a bit puzzled by the versus, authentic versus natural, because for me it comes together.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so the work they're doing could apply, but it also...
So it has to be authentic, otherwise it cannot be applicable.
Absolutely. So definitely they can coincide. Ownership? How so?
Because he has to feel responsible and ownership to apply.
Okay.
So,
So authentic could also mean meaningful.
yeah.
Absolutely. So here is a project that I once did with my high school freshmen, so those are 14-year-olds. I gave them this scenario. I said, okay, there's an airplane flying over the world, and the world has ended. So the Armageddon has happened, and there's only one airplane full of people left. And on this airplane, well, there might be some people scattered down there, but on this airplane are some of the greatest leaders throughout all of history. So, I mean, you've got Mother Teresa on there, Charlemagne, Winston Churchill, Margaret Thatcher, even Adolf Hitler's on this plane. But the plane is starting to crash. And there's only one parachute aboard. And so the question is, who gets that parachute and therefore gets to lead the world and to help rebuild the world? So essentially I'm asking, who's the greatest leader of all time? And so I broke up all these different groups, and kids adopted a different leader, and they learned everything they could about their assigned leader. And then we had this bracket style debate, a playoff debate, where I would pair up Mother Teresa against Genghis Khan, and we would have these debates about why Mother Teresa is the best, and they'd have to do all this research about their opposition, and why Genghis Khan is the worst, and they had these great debates, and eventually it came down to the very end, and it came down to Mother Teresa and Charlemagne debated, and the winner was the greatest leader in all of history. So it was great, the kids loved it. However, I don't know if it was absolutely authentic, because I doubt you're ever going to have to make that decision in the real world, right? You're probably not going to have to get into the workplace and have to make this really tough decision about who gets the parachute to save the world. Maybe you do. I guess America had a pretty big important choice to make about a leader, and they picked the wrong parachute. So this is applicable, because there's some things within this project that are going to apply in the career world. They're going to have to learn how to do intensive research at times and make good decisions. They're going to have to learn how to get in front of people and make a point. They're public speaking. So it's got all these applicable traits. And to me, this was a successful project. However, there's also authentic projects. And when I say authentic, I mean it's not just going to apply to someday, but instead it's authentic, it's applying now. So for instance, I had a project this year, that's one of my students, her name is Ruby, and I had this unit, I teach English, high school, and so literature, creative writing, and we had this project where I had to teach them standards about what makes up a story, and then I also had some grammar standards that I wanted to get across. And so while I'm teaching these standards, my students were creating children's books, and they were writing these books, and they were illustrating the books, and they had to have themes and hit all of the points of plot and everything that goes into the story, everything that was prescribed by the state standards that I had to teach. But while they're doing that, they're creating these books. And we're also reading short stories and analyzing literature and doing all the work that we would do anyway. But it was all to create these books. I'm going to take the knowledge of what I'm learning in class to create something authentic that we then took to a local primary school, and they read to these children. And then they gifted these books to the kids. And their motivation to learn the parts of a story and to learn all of this content wasn't to get a good grade. It wasn't to make me happy as their teacher or their parents happy. It was so they would have an excellent product to bring to these primary school kids. So when you have this authentic audience, it all of a sudden ups the game. Are you with me? right? So when I say you have to have perfect grammar, it's not just because you want to do well in the grammar quiz. It's because with 8-year-olds who are just learning the fundamentals of grammar, they will call you out for every time you don't capitalize an I by itself, right? If you forget to put a period, those little kids are going to know, and I've done this in the past where I didn't really focus too much on grammar, and our kids got called out for it. Like my students, the kids would be like, I have a question, why did you just write the letter U instead of writing Y-O-U? And like, and my students felt embarrassed by it, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, this is why we really need to like learn this grammar. This is why we really need to pay attention and do the work in the class, so that whatever we're creating, this authentic piece, is presented well. Because we all know that bad grammar, poor grammar, is distracting. And that's whatever it is. So when there's authenticity tied into it, there's such a higher level of standards for the work that you create, and the learning that happens. Now, I would also say a project like this has a service aspect to it, right? And that's how I presented it to my students, is you're creating these books so we can show younger children that there's value to learning, that there's value to literacy and reading. And so that was part of the motivator as well. I want to ask this question. So if you could turn to the people around you and maybe create a list. If you have something to write with, feel free to write it. If you have a really great memory, you can also just have somebody remember it. I'd like you to create a list of all of the reasons why we should have service learning in our schools. And so when I say service learning, it means it has some type of, you're helping somebody else outside of yourself in the learning that's happening in school. So what are some reasons why we should have this idea of empathy in our schools? So maybe just create a list, talk with each other. No, and I'll make my work. Maybe take 30 more seconds. Okay, let's, I'm kind of rushing things just because of our limited time, so I apologize. But can we, I would love to hear some of the different things that we wrote down and see what we have in common on our thoughts on this. So why should we have, what are some reasons why we should have a service aspect in our schools? What are some of the benefits of it? Someone just read one thing on their list. Excuse me? It's more fun. It's more fun? Okay, so it's just more fun when you're doing something for somebody else. Absolutely. There's a clear purpose behind the work. I agree. I think we so often, I can only speak from my experiences, but as a student, I can't tell you how many times I ask myself, why am I doing this? Has anybody ever asked that question? Why am I learning this? When am I going to use this? So, purpose.
Practical. It's practical.
Practical?
Yeah.
Absolutely. It makes sense? Yes?
I think it's sort of disruptive in a good way. So a lot of what we do is focused on relevance, and our technology, our social media, it's all about we will get you what you want. It's about you. It's about personal brand, all that kind of stuff. But when you can pull students out of that and say, actually, it's not about you, in a good way. In other words, I don't know how to say this. This could be cultural, but definitely in America, there's a huge shift toward more and more and more individualism, less and less community. And the institutions that used to support community are kind of fading. And so getting students to think about service was a shift toward helping them to see the community matters as much as individuals. That's a long answer.
No, feel free to keep doing that.
There's also the other way around, I think, because when schools go to the community also sees the added value of schools and pupils and the effective learning.
I think we have to teach empathy, right? I think we have to teach it. I have a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old, and my 3-year-old's natural inclination is to not be nice to his little sister, right? He doesn't think about her feelings when he takes her toys away and she starts screaming. And I'm like, Jack, why, do you want to hear her cry? And, no, and then runs away. And I'm like, no. So I think, and then you start asking questions like, what would it feel like if she took that toy from you? And we're teaching empathy. We all know this. And so I think you're absolutely right about that, is teaching students to think outside of themselves, because that doesn't necessarily come natural. And we can expect parents to do that. Anything that was left off your list that you haven't heard so far about why we should do this?
We have a thing called target groups and markets.
Okay.
Learn how to go to the future.
Okay. Oh, so kind of thinking about what you're going to do later on.
It could be about anything. Let's say you want to become a nurse. It's not nice that you know what the patients are going to be like. Could be a teacher. Could be marketing and sell stuff to customers. That would be also nice if you know what makes them tick.
Absolutely. There's a career readiness aspect to it. Absolutely. Last one. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I think it's also about the process. And the kids, they can develop to be experts. Like when you were saying that you went to the primary schools,
Yes.
they made their own books, and I can imagine that the little ones admire them. And like, well, you write your own storybooks and you're reading them out, of course.
Absolutely. There's an inspiration aspect to it. Inspiring others. And then did you have one?
I think it's almost the same. You talked about explaining to somebody else is good for your own learning process.
Absolutely. And that kind of hits on the last point that I wanted to make. So you kind of spoiled you spoiled my punchline, by the way, just so you know. Well, so this was asked in an academic study about asking the exact same question to teachers, and only 12% of them, and I don't know what our percentage here, but it's less than 12%, said to improve student achievement in core academic courses. I think there is a direct correlation between service learning, so learning that happens outside of oneself, so it's more than just personal benefit. There's extrinsic value to it. Like it's more than just my grade book, my personal success. When you have extrinsic value to learning, there's always, at least in my experience, some type of academic result. Because the authenticity of the work, doing something that matters, is going to drive that content learning along. I like to call it, well, so authenticity drives the content. I like to call it, I took it out. Oh, you know what I did? I took it out so I could save it for my keynote. Never mind. I almost ruined another punchline. So the authenticity drives the content. Get ready to hear that same line again later on. Kids being motivated by doing work that matters to them is going to somehow, I don't know if it's magic or if it's just because they're engaged, their brains are locked into the work, that when you say, okay, right now we're going to work on our children's books, and then we're going to take a break from that and we're going to do a grammar lesson. And I don't know about you, I can't think of very many ways to make teaching grammar exciting and engaging. It's just, there's only, semicolons serve one purpose, and I have to just tell you what it is, and I might have to make you do some practice worksheets on it, and I might have to stand at a board and do it. Some of the things I do not like to do, but they need to learn grammar. But when they're engaged in that work that means something to them, and you say, okay, we're going to shift over and do some grammar work, usually that engagement shifts with them. Does that make sense? It moves with them. And that's why I think there's always this academic result of having authenticity in the classroom. For instance, if you look at, these are content standards that I have, these are state standards. I also teach history, and at first glance you look at this and you might think, that doesn't look very exciting to me. You know, traditionally, the way I was taught is my teacher would go through and kind of just checklist, and he'd have a textbook that would open up and he would lecture about each one of these topics for about a month, and I would write it all down. And then I would take a test on it and I'd regurgitate it all out, and then I'd discard all that information so I can learn more information. Does that ring a bell with anybody? That's what a lot of traditional education looks like, seemingly everywhere, because I've been hearing from many people in the last couple of days that there's still a lot of this sit and get information. So I take a look at standards like this and I try to identify what's important here. How can I take the idea of world religions, and genocide, and Middle East, growth of Islam, how can I take these different standards that I'm going to have to teach and make it authentic for my students? How can I make it mean something to them? And what can drive these standards? I'm going to tell you about a quick project we did. This is a local college in my town in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It's called Aquinas, and I had to represent, so I called the dean at Aquinas, she was in charge of the education program, and I invited her into my classroom to talk. And we had a meeting beforehand about what she would talk about, but she essentially said, I have education students, so they're going to become teachers at some point, and they've all been taught in a traditional method, and I want them to see that there's other ways to teach. And since your class, my class, since you kids, you students, have experience doing alternative ways of learning, I was wondering if maybe I could give you a set of standards and you could kind of create some type of lesson that the way you would want to be taught these standards. Does that make sense? So so she said to them, if you had to learn this, what would be the best way for you to learn this? She asked this to my high school students. And she said, okay, so here's your task. In a month, I would like you to come to our school, to our college, and we'd like you to present a presentation on what your lesson plan would look like to our college students, to our university students, and just let them kind of gain some inspiration for you. And so my students spent a month learning these standards, really getting to understand these standards, doing self-research, having to listen to some talking about it. They read stories about it. They dug really deep into the content, not because of the test, not because I said, hey, here's standards that you have to meet, but because if you don't master these standards, good luck trying to teach somebody about them. You know what I mean? Good luck standing in front of really scary university students who my students think are like celebrities. Good luck standing in front of them and presenting something coherent and that's useful to them. And so my students created these lesson plans, and they created simulations, they created interactive websites. I had one student that was really into creating online games, and so he created like an online game, like a Crusades game for the iPad. So they created all these things and they tied the content into it, and then we went to the local university and they presented. And if you notice, my students all dressed up in nice suits and dresses, and they were like, they took it serious. And they were doing work that not only applies to the real world, like they did work that will look very similar to some of the work they'll do someday. Presenting to people, dressing up and looking nice when it's necessary, being able to really understand information and deliver it. But this was authentic to them then. Because the service aspect was, and my students, they learn in this project-based atmosphere and they do love it. And they'll often say like, oh, I don't want to leave this class and go back and just sit in rows all day long and listen to people talking. Like, they always say that. And so it was like, how can we prevent that from happening for kids in the future? What can you do about that? Like, here's a big opportunity for you. You're going to have a bunch of future teachers, educators, in this room. Here's your chance to help influence them in some ways. And they did. We got a bunch of thank you notes from these university students thanking us for coming in and thanking my students individually. Like, oh, that was a great idea. And someday when I teach history, I would love to use that simulation. Could you send it to me? My students created a bunch of websites where they housed all of these lesson plans as well. And they just gave the URL to these university students saying, hey, here's a resource you get to have now. And so there's a service aspect to it. But my principal doesn't really care about the service aspect. That's not really her priority. Her priority is that my students pass tests and exams. Her priority is that my students are ready for college and they get into the schools that they want to get into. That's not my number one priority, but I'm also not naive. That is what the state requires. That is what the school requires, the school district, the community requires. My students do well on all of those tests. A study was done on project-based learning, and there is a 24% higher high school graduation rate when students are in a project-based learning atmosphere versus not being in one. Because the content is still being delivered. You know, there's still content being taught. Students are still having these discussions and learning and researching and reading, but it's being driven by this authentic aspect of the learning. Are you with me? So we have about 11 minutes left, so I might, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but one time I had a representative from a social work agency come into my class, and my students just got a chance to talk to her about what she does, and one of the things that they learned when she was there, it was a very small part of the story, but she said a lot of refugees who come to Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is about 10 degrees colder than this right now, just as gray, just colder and snowier. A lot of the refugees who come in have no preparation for winter. And so they're coming from sub-Saharan Africa and aren't prepared for winter. And they also don't have the resources for it. And so many of the refugees in our community don't have shoes. And one of my students really heard that when this woman was giving this talk. And so after she left, we had to talk about it. What do we do about this? Like, what did you take away? And one of my students said, well, they don't have shoes. And all my students were shocked. What do you mean? We live in the 21st century. There's people who don't have shoes in winter, and yet they still have to walk to the bus stop. And so I had all these standards that had to be taught. These were the standards that I was teaching. Evaluate various explanation for actions or events. Initiate, participate effectively in a range of collaborative discussions. Things that I can fit around and mold around anything. I can find a theme in this. I started asking myself this question: where do my passions lie? I have a heart for refugees. I think that just as a personal, like that's part of me, that I believe refugees get a short end of the stick because for many, many reasons. And so I have a passion there. My students have a passion. I know that. And so I start thinking, what can I do with these standards? Where do my passions lie? I start to look for an authentic audience. So I have a theme. I have this main idea of what I want my students to do. Who could they present to? What's going to ramp up the authenticity of this project? Who's their audience going to be? I found a local social work agency who works with refugees, and she was the one who came in and talked to my students. To get in touch with that refugee agency, I had to contact them. And I don't know about you, but in my teacher preparation program, there was nothing about cold calling. Is that a term you're familiar with? Yeah, there was nothing about picking up the phone and calling anyone. That's a frightening thing to do, at least for me. I remember and I'll talk to many teachers, I'll say, hey, I've got this really great idea, but I'm nervous about reaching out to this company. I'm worried about that. Like, what if they say no? Or I want to reach out to the social work agency, but I don't know, and there's this fear there, right? And I'm not sure what that fear is, but we're afraid to reach out because it's not what we normally do. That's outside of our usual job description in many situations. Not at Fontes. You guys probably do a lot of professional outreach. But before I became a teacher, I worked in business development. And so I worked for a liquidation company that would buy up big companies and then sell off the assets. And my job was to find business for our sales team to sell. And so I sat at a phone all day just calling companies that I see it's a really joyful work. Companies that are closing and asking if we can buy all of their stuff to go sell. So,
I need a great
oh man. And then I went into teaching. And part of that job is I had to call the chief financial officers and the chief executives of very big companies. You know, of Walmart was one of the clients I had to call on. And I remember I would not do it because I was scared to death of it. And my boss pulled me aside one day, and I thought I was going to get fired or canned. And he said, "Hey, I see you're not bringing in very many numbers. What's going on?" I said, "I'll level with you. I'm afraid to pick up the phone and call some of these people. They're like millionaires. I'm not good at talking to millionaires. I'm a 22-year-old. This was a while ago." And he said, "Well, let me just tell you this. We have a good company. I mean, it's not the funnest task, but what we're doing is a necessity for these companies. And we provide a good service, and we're good people. And so why would you be afraid of offering a good service to somebody?" I thought about it like that. And yeah, it's not the most joyful work, but this is a service, and we are good people. I was working at a good company, and that set in with me. And so, as a teacher, I've got a good company, right? My students are highly capable of doing excellent work that's meaningful and has the ability to transform our communities. Why would I be afraid to reach out to somebody to ask them to be a part of it? And I found more often than not, especially with this, like an organization like this, a nonprofit, but also profit-making organizations, they're very, very eager to come and be a part of the classroom. For one, it's free labor. Two, they're looking, these are future employees for them. You know, they're exposing, this is a good way of headhunting and finding good people to work for them. But three, they want to be a part of it. And so I just wanted to throw that in there, but that we should never hesitate to reach out to the community and even professionals to invite them into what we're doing, because there's so much value. And then I find an authentic audience. This was my authentic audience for this project. Bethany Christian Services, the refugee agency, they came in after a month. They came in the first time, and then they came in a month later. And my students for that month, while we learned about the plight of refugees, and we had big, deep discussions, and they wrote historical fiction based on refugee territories. They did all of this work. They also put on these big shoe drives. And they put up boxes and bins all over the city collecting shoes, and they reached out to the news, the media, and said, "Hey, we're doing this big project, we're collecting shoes." And at the end of the project, and then I should have put the video in here. I told them, if we fill up this bin with shoes, I'll do a polar plunge. Are you familiar with a polar plunge? We cut out a hole in the ice, and I had to jump into the water and go swimming in ice water. They said, if you fill this bin, well, you can't see it all here, but they filled this bin, and then they stacked it all the way to the ceiling with shoes. We had over 700 pairs of really, really nice shoes to make sure that refugees in West Michigan don't have to be barefoot in the winter. Now, that kind of authenticity makes kids eager to be in your classroom. And when they're eager to be in your classroom, they'll do anything for you, including writing essays and learning grammar and formatting and all the things that we dread to teach because they're not interested. That interest is there because there's real work going on. Now, a side note, one of my students was sitting in class that day when the refugee left that very first day, and we came up with the idea for the shoe drive, and one of my students, her name was Haley, she was so excited about this project that she pulls out her phone, and underneath the desk she emailed the local news and said, "Hey, we'd love to invite you to our class and come and talk to us about this project we're doing." And so the news called my school and said, "Hey, we got a message from Mr. Muir's class. We'd like to come in and do a story on it." And my principal saw that and said, "Why are students using their phones in class?" What? There is a protocol to contacting the news, and you did not follow it. And I was put on probation for that. And so also keep in mind that sometimes you're fighting against the system to do this kind of work. But I will gladly do it. And I took that letter, put it in my permanent folder as a badge of honor. So that's a true story. I don't work at that school anymore. I went somewhere where they embrace this whole, "How dare you help refugees?" Yeah, make America great again. I say that with sarcasm. I just want to make sure that's across. All right. So anyway, we're still assessing content. We're still doing important work. They're still preparing for tests. This is all beautiful, but what about math? Anybody saying that? Do we have any math teachers in here? This is something I get a lot. People get really inspired by all this work. They're like, that's great, but I have to teach linear equations, and I have to teach trigonometry. Like, how do you do that? And my answer is, and this doesn't make sense to you now, that's the slide I took out, I forgot to take it out of this one. You just do the same thing. So authenticity, I'm just making you wonder now, what the heck is he doing there? Authenticity will drive the content. This is a project a physics teacher did at our school. They were studying perpetual motion, how fast things fall in different atmospheres and environments. And so for a month, his challenge, he had this really competitive group of students, and he said to them, here's your challenge. I want you to take these ladders into the hallway, and you're going to start dropping golf balls, and you're going to time how long it takes for them to get to the ground, and you're going to study the mass and volume of golf balls and math stuff, science, and you're going to time it. And then at the end of the month, we're going to call the city utilities department, and they're going to come in with a 60-foot tall bucket truck, and we're going to drop pumpkins from the top of this bucket truck, and we're going to see which of you can get closest to guessing the amount of time that it takes for a 20-pound pumpkin or 5-pound pumpkin to hit the ground. And so that was it. And we invited all these elementary students in to the school, and all these buses came and watched it, and the media came, and there was like this big celebration. It was almost like a festival. It was the Great Pumpkin Drop. It was the day after Halloween, and so we had all of these like rotting pumpkins that we got for free because the science teacher called a pumpkin patch and said, hey, can we get some free pumpkins? Yes. And they called the city utilities. Hey, would you charge us anything to come out and let us borrow your bucket truck? No, we'd love to do that. It's good press. And so, again, reaching out. And they came and did that. And they had the big pumpkin drop, and everybody was celebrating and having a good time, except for those physics students, because they were standing around this tarp with stopwatches timing pumpkin drops. And then the winner of this was the Great Pumpkin Champion, and they won a trophy, and it was this big celebration, and they got to hold that title until the next year when they did it again. Let's see if this, I don't know how to, I'm going to try to hit play real quick. Here's a quick little video on it. This will be the last thing. You can see how kids would get fired up about that. Now I want to make a quick point. They didn't learn all of the standards that the teacher had to teach within that month from that one project. There was stuff that just wouldn't fit into doing the Great Pumpkin Drop. However, there was enough there to where you could get the kids motivated, and we'd say, okay guys, today you're going to go do your experiments in the hallway at the end of class, and you're going to do your timings. Before that, we're going to look at some other stuff. And the kids knew that was coming. The engagement and excitement was there for the experiments they were conducting that day and for that overall work. But there was some stuff where it looked a little bit more traditional, and they just taught like teachers sometimes teach, and that's using best practices. That's using collaboration and sometimes teacher up front and all the things that we're all experts at already. But it was still driven by the authenticity. It was still driven by doing something important. So anyway, I think that's all the time we have now. Although nobody's here yet, so if anybody has questions.
I've got a question.
Yes?
You spoke about you were represented and they talked about reputation
Mm-hmm.
I'm working at a school now for a short time. About 5 years ago, they did this huge switch around to project-based learning,
Mm-hmm.
and they got a reprimand for inspection.
Mm-hmm.
And so the whole school turned around again to all traditional systems. And now they are talking about what can we use, but make it responsible and in a transparent way.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a big, I don't know, doubt whether they want to do it.
Sure. How long were they project-based learning before they switched?
I think about 3 years.
3 years. So I've read that innovation usually has a 4 to 5 year shelf life. And that's the point where it's decided, do we continue to innovate and refine what we're doing, or do we return to the institution?
So you need to get the chance.
You gotta give it the chance because it takes time. It's a paradigm shift. It's a shift from what we're used to. And so, I mean, and I truly believe the school I was at where I got reprimanded, that was in its 4th year. And that was the year that they brought in a new administrator, and that school is no longer project-based. Now they look like every other school. And at that 4-year mark, they decided to no longer innovate and refine and make that work better. Instead, they decided to go back to the institution. And you see that with a lot of different things. And a lot of startup companies, to where they start with this like brash innovation and this desire to change, and then it returns and it turns into a corporate, or they go public and they lose a lot of that innovation that initially drove it. And so that to me is a sad story, because I can't imagine that in 3 years you're going to be able to take a whole staff of teachers and make them all proficient in doing this. Because it's taken me time. You know, there was projects where I had this great idea for a project and we created these documentaries, and I'll tell you more about that later. And I was early on in this and I kind of forgot to teach the content. Like, you know, I'm doing a whole project on World War II and we're doing all this amazing work, and I just didn't get to the content very much. And I guess I say to my students from then, sorry. Now when I do that project, it's so much more effective. It's so much more valuable, and I've got it worked out a lot more. But I did not have it worked out in the first 2-3 years. And so I to school leaders, I would say you've got to have grace. And also, I don't think you have to dive all the way in on this, and maybe that's a mistake that happened too, is when you go full steam into project-based learning.
They were integrating as well, math and English,
Mhm.
so it was very hard for them to find each other
Yeah,
in a project.
it's difficult.
Yeah.
I think there's I think there's a lot of fads in education, and often they're very good and valuable. I think project-based learning is one of them, that people get really high on this idea of doing this kind of work, and that's all they do, and they think that's the only answer. Or you see something like Genius Hour, where every week you have 20 minutes, or you get an hour. 20% of the time is spent on just doing free, exciting work, and that's a great, awesome, like amazing thing. Or you might have, you know, even STEM, putting all of your emphasis on this. These are good, however, that's not the only way to do things. I think project-based learning is a vehicle to doing work. But as I said, there's still traditional work that's effective. You know, I think if you have a classroom or a teacher who does 20% time, where kids have unlimited innovation once a week, for the other teachers in that school who don't offer that kind of freedom, kids start to resent that time with them, right? And so maybe just, and so when you have to go to a class that doesn't give you that kind of freedom, all of a sudden they're not as effective in there because all they can think about is the good work they get to go do in other classes. So should there be balance? Should there be spreading it out? Should there be, and maybe we don't dive all the way into project-based learning, but maybe once in the first semester, the first 6 months of the school year, maybe we do one authentic project. You know, maybe I bring in one professional to my room and really test it out and get my students experience with it and me some experience. And then maybe the next semester we add 2 authentic audiences. And then after maybe 5 years of that, 3 years of that, all of your work has some authentic piece to it. But I think that's a really good point that you brought up that I should mention is this is no one size fits all. My main point is that authenticity drives content. So the more authentic we can make learning, the more valuable it can be for students. We were done at 10, correct? Okay. Thank you very much. You bet.
Thank you.
Thank you, Trevor. Trevor will be here for the keynote as well. And he will be here anyway, so it's
I'm going back to my hotel.
right now we're going to switch back, move to your own base camp. So if your base camp is over here, you can stay here. Otherwise, you can go to your to either Cato or Claire's to continue the design process. And your expedition leader will tell you what to do next. Okay,
zoveel heen dat het niet genoeg focus krijgt. Ja, dat is grappig, je denkt rekenen.
I think you would. Short instructions. One
I have to install the... Sure. Hey.
three main design areas I accomplish. Technical design reasons, for the art design part, and so that all students area, which was designated in the 1990s. Now the design is
Yeah.
so. Yeah, that's a great area. So about 10 years, it's slow. There's so much more to do now.
Is there ever, so, like, I live in Oregon in the United States, and Portland was like a hub of innovation and amazing transformation. And now it's destinations but it's like priced to so many small startups out that it's actually nothing new is coming from it. So is there ever the same thing like in the US that's happened in the last
zijn eigenlijk voor.